wants to share with us. Of course, most all of you know Tom Childers. He preached here for about 10 years in the 90s, and we are so thankful that he is able to be with us. We appreciate Brother Tom. He and Miss Carol were wonderful encouragers and continue to be wonderful encouragers for me, for Jesse and I, and for all of you. And we are looking forward to kicking off this centennial celebration this afternoon as we look back to the history of the church. As we are continuing this legacy, we want to look back and reflect. And Brother Tom is a church historian. He has done more research on church history than most people have as far as churches of Christ go, and we are so thankful that he has agreed to come be back with us this afternoon. When I asked Brother Tom to make this presentation for us, I had no idea just how much work he would put into this research and then into his presentation. But he has spent several hours researching just lately at the Sentinel, and several more hours getting the presentation ready. But really and truly, being a native of Tippah County and growing up here in the congregation, he has been looking forward to this, I think, maybe his whole life, if he knew it or not. So we are thankful that Brother Tom has agreed to come be with us tonight and to share this material with us. So as we're going through this, I want you to remember all the great sacrifices, all the hard work that was put into this church, and then also look forward to what we can do in the future, how we can continue to grow, how we can continue to build, and what the future can be like if we continue to work serving our God together. Michael Harrison is going to lead us in a prayer, and then we'll turn it over to Brother Tom.
Would you please bow with me? Our most holy and righteous Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this opportunity, Father, to come together as your people and to celebrate this congregation here at Ripley. We're so thankful for all the members that we have now. We're so thankful for the members of the past, for the great influences that they have had on our lives, for the great things that they have done that have helped shape and mold this congregation into what it is today. And we pray, Father, that we'll continue that legacy of being good examples, and that we will leave the same kind of influence that they left on us for the ones that are born or just being born or will be born in the future. And this church will continue to thrive and grow and continue to do more good works in your name. Father, we're so thankful for Brother Tom and his work that he has done in putting together this presentation about the congregation here at Ripley. And we're thankful for his ability and his research and for his life and for his service and ministry in your name and in this congregation and many congregations throughout our area. And we're so thankful for him being here this evening. We pray that you'd bless him and continue to bless him as he continues to preach your word and to be involved in many other works. Father, please forgive us of our sins, for we know that we fall short often. We're thankful most of all for your Son, Jesus, and for the blessings that we have in him. We ask all this in his holy name, and amen. I'll also mention before Brother Tom gets up here, we do have some directories, old directories, in the foyer, and there's some other things that you might want to look at. There's also pictures of the new building that's going to be built, a rendering at that, and the floor plan also that are on display out in the foyer if you get a chance to look at that. We're excited about that. We're excited about Brother Tom, and I'll ask him to come up now and start his presentation.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come and be with you. This is quite an honor. I've got a lot of material to cover. If I go by too fast, I'm going to make this available to you, and you can actually read it later on. But we're here to celebrate 100 years, and that is quite an accomplishment. Remember that this is a work in progress, and I would challenge some of you who love history to take my material and build on it and keep it going. That's the key to it. Make it easier on future generations as they are wondering about the history of the Ripley Church of Christ. I'm going to make it available on thumb drive, and I have videos. I have 4 or 5 directories that I've scanned. All the material, all the research material that I have, I think it's 400 and something photographs that I've done of the Sentinel, going through and looking at that. So, and I've tried to document every reference so that if you want to go and double check my work, then it'll be there to do that. One of the things you need to understand is that before 1890, the Church of Christ and the Christian church were basically the same. Now, as we look at some of this material, it will switch back and forth. Church of Christ, Christian church, that sort of thing. In 1890, there were only 4 churches in the whole state of Tennessee that had instrumental music. 1 in Memphis, 1 in Nashville, 1 in Chattanooga, and 1 in Henderson, Tennessee. And after that, around 1900 or so, for the most part, you can't say this is always the way it is, but basically the ones that are in this area, Church of Christ, that means a cappella, it means non-instrumental. Christian church means that they are promoting the Missionary Society and they want to use the instrument in worship. Also, you'll see the word reverend and pastor. These are terms that are usually applied not because the preacher is wanting that title applied to him. I know when I was here in Ripley, sometimes they would announce my name at a funeral or something, and they would attach a reverend. I had nothing to do with that, and once it's in print, you can't undo it. So just keep that in mind as we look at some of these things. Here are some of my sources. 1855 to 63. 1963, the Gospel Advocate digitized. I can search any word or phrase or place and find it during that period of time. I've made 3 trips to Ripley, spent time looking over the bound volumes of the Southern Sentinel. Preachers of today, I'm in 4 of those 5 versions. I'm not in 1952, but I am in the rest of them. A short biography and usually a picture of a preacher that is given there. Find a Grave is a good resource. I have tagged virtual cemetery for every preacher associated with the Ripley congregation. So you can go there, go to my profile, and find other things. Joe Eiley in 1954 published a book about Churches of Christ in Mississippi, and so that is one of the sources. There are several directories. I said I had 4. The 3 of those are listed right there. I have some video of Calvary, of Monroe and Edna Calvary, also of Bessie and Sims Beavers, that I'm going to make available on this thumb drive as well. And we talk about the church as they remember it. They were members, or at least she was a member, Edna was, in the 1930s. And then Dwayne Bullard's book on Tippah County, Images of America. First of all, we need to define what we mean by the Restoration Movement. And this is especially for the young people, but it's for everybody. What do we mean when we talk about the Restoration Movement? Well, I want to give you an example. I want to give an illustration of what I'm talking about. Here is a picture of a farmer who was born in Perry County, Linden, Tennessee area. And when he went to the field to plow his mules, he took with him his Bible. And he would plow for 30 minutes or so, and then he would rest, and he would read his Bible. And he was a member of a denominational church, and the following Sunday, after the preacher preached, he said, "Preacher, I do not read in my Bible what you preached this morning." So the preacher said, "What do you read in your Bible?" And he said, "Well, I read where Christians met on the first day of every week to eat the Lord's Supper. They do not use instrumental music. They do not use creed books. They use the name Christian only." And he said, "You sound like a Campbellite." And his response was, "What's a Campbellite?" He had never heard of Alexander Campbell. And he said, "Well, there's a group of them meeting just right down the road." So the next Sunday, guess where this man was? For the first time in his life, he heard preach from a pulpit what he had been reading in his Bible. See, the Bible is the seed. It's the Word of God. And when you read that and you believe that, then you're able to recognize whether somebody is preaching or teaching the truth or not. So it was the Word of God that converted him. It was not Alexander Campbell or some man. He had never heard of Alexander Campbell. He was just a farmer reading his Bible. And so that's what we mean by the Restoration Movement. You're not going after some man and what he's teaching. You're reading the Bible, deciding in your own mind what the Bible is, and you go from there. He became a gospel preacher, and he preached in Perry County for many years. He had a daughter by the name of Dalphia, and she went to Freed-Hardeman, and she met a young preacher student there by the name of J.A. Thornton, Gene Thornton, and they got married. And Gene Thornton was from Tiplersville, and they had a daughter named Joyce. And Joyce met this man at Freed-Hardeman by the name of Ralph Gilmore. And Ralph Gilmore is just retired after many years at Freed-Hardeman. So here is how it works. You believe the Bible, you follow the Bible, and then you teach it to your children and to your grandchildren. You keep on passing it down and telling them to do the very same thing. And that's the challenge that we have. It's not enough just for our generation to be faithful. We need to teach this principle to our children and our grandchildren, and for that to keep on going. There are three things that I want to do if I have enough time, and that is I want to talk about the Restoration Movement within 50 miles of Ripley, Mississippi. Before we can really understand about how the church at Ripley started, we need to understand what happened years before that period of time. So we're going to do that. And then we're going to talk about the Ripley Church of Christ, its beginning and its early history. And then I want to talk about some of the roots that I have in the Ripley congregation. So we'll start out first of all. When was the church first planted? When was it first planted in North Mississippi? Well, let's look at our beloved state of Mississippi. It became the Mississippi Territory in 1798. It became a state in 1817. And it was, before that time, the home of the Chickasaw Indians. And it was in Alabama, northern Mississippi, West Tennessee, and even on up into Kentucky. In 1829, the Chickasaw Indians lost all land claims. In 1832, there was the Indian Removal Treaty. They were moved out. They were transported out. And then in 1836, my third great-grandfather moved from Lincoln County, Tennessee. He moved to Tippah County, Mississippi on an ox cart, and he established Little Hope Primitive Baptist Church, Pine Hill Primitive Baptist Church, New Salem, Antioch, and maybe another or two. Both sets of my parents are buried in Little Hope, and sometimes I tell people where my family's buried, and they'll kind of snicker a little bit about it's Little Hope. And my response is, well, it's better to have a little hope than no hope at all. So, but anyway, my first funeral, when I was 8 years old, I walked through that door, and I walked out the side door. I remember it just like it was yesterday. My mother's brother died of tuberculosis. He had lived with us for a while, and for the next, probably 10 or 12, 15 years, I had to get a TB x-ray every year because I had been living with someone that had TB. The day he was sent to the sanatorium, my mother stripped all the bed clothes. She took the mattress out to our gully, and she burned everything. And he died a few years later. I was walking in the cemetery wondering, about 1973 or 4, who's the oldest person buried in this cemetery? And down at the bottom it says he was an elder in the Baptist church. So I asked everybody I knew. I asked Haskell Wallace. I asked my daddy. I asked the preacher who was preaching there. I asked everybody. Nobody knew who this man was. He had established that congregation, and nobody knew who he was. Isn't that a shame? You don't have any idea. You go to church there, and you don't have any idea who started that congregation. Well, a few years later, or a few months later, my daddy came up with a book and showed that he was an elder in the Primitive Baptist Church. And I tell folks I'm trying to undo everything that he did back in those periods of time. I don't know how successful I am, but anyway, I keep trying. But the question is, if you had a church started when the Tippah County first became a county in 1836, why is it that in 1893 you have a union established by T.B. Larimore? What about the 57 years prior to that? Where was the church? Well, you know, we're not very good about keeping records. We're not very good about sharing information. And there are some people that want to rewrite us and just write us completely out of any kind of history. And so sometimes you're looking for answers. I was looking as a young person for answers. Why is it that I'm a member of the church that started in 1923 and your others have been around over 100 years before that period of time? What about that? Well, I'm here to tell you that the church was here, the Church of Christ was here from the very beginning. And I want to prove that to you. Holly Springs, 1825. They told me this thing had a happy trigger to it, so I'll try not to be trigger happy. In The Millennial Harbinger by Alexander Campbell, there's a Dr. Brown that writes, he writes right in the middle, not long since I attended a call of some of the brethren at Holly Springs, now the county seat of Marshall County, where a church was constituted upwards of 20 members who there and then agreed to meet every Lord's Day for the purpose of reading the word, prayer, praise, breaking the loaf, etc. And then, if you go Highway 4 west, you pass the levee at Snow Lake Shores, take the next right, and go about a mile out behind the house is a man who is a member of the Holly Springs Church, governor of Mississippi. He died in 1862. And his brother is buried west of Senatobia in DeSoto County. And this is the man, James Evans Matthews, the brother to him. He's the one who established, along with William Lipscomb, not David, but William Lipscomb, the Gospel Advocate that started in 1855. So here are preachers that have been around for a long period of time. I was privileged to preach for 5 years for the New Hope congregation, which is the second oldest congregation still meeting in West Tennessee. Roans Creek is number one, starting 1825. Look at what was going on just a few miles north of us almost 200 years ago. There was a man by the name of Henry Thompson, and he was a gospel preacher, he was a teacher, he was a poet. And he changed his name from Thompson, and he got rid of the P and he got rid of the H because he said those two letters are useless. So that was created quite a chore because some of his children kept the same name, some of them used it different. There are a lot of different spellings that are going. Here, now another thing you need to understand is the word elder in this document doesn't refer to elders in the church, it refers to a preacher. And so here are three preachers who are basically vouching for this man being sound in the faith. We, the undersigned elders of the Church of Christ, being satisfied of the piety of our beloved brother Henry Thompson, and believing that he possesses the character and qualifications to fill the office of elder in the Church of Christ, do hereby certify that we have this day ordained him to that office by prayer and imposition of our hands. And notice the date, November the 25th, 1830. And here's a book that he wrote in 1832, and he was an Episcopal Methodist preacher, but he made an appeal, let's just be called Christians, let's wear the name Christian and Christian only. And he makes this statement, we may set up our sectarian names and compound them over and over again with other sectarian epitaphs, but that every follower of Christ desires to be at the last is a Christian. That was being preached and lived out in 1830, just a few miles from here. John Howard's paper in 1836, it's the oldest paper associated with the Restoration Movement in the state of Tennessee. It was published in Paris, Tennessee. And I came across a copy of this just a few years ago. And it was on microfilm, and we finally got it transferred where we could read it a lot easier. And so let me read, here's a statement from Tennessee Christian about it being the first paper published in the interest of the Christian church. Keep in mind, Christian church, Church of Christ back then. Here is when Howard lived and died, 1807, 1870. And here he's talking about, this is in 1836, he's talking about Tolbert Fanning, the one that James E. Matthews had baptized, the man who starts the Gospel Advocate. He is talking about him visiting down in Mississippi, and he is going to come back through Paris and visit with him. Here is the front cover. You can't see it very well, but there is an agent, and that agent is in Lexington, Holmes County, Mississippi. And then you have, in 1836, you have several people mentioned, and one of them is Dr. Brown of the Chickasaw Nation, Mississippi. That's the way it's referred to. Then in 1936, you can't read it very well, but there's a man's name in Holly Springs. His name is Greer. His last name is Greer. Then in 1842, at the bottom, down at the bottom, you'll see J.M. Northcross. Second line from the bottom. And here is who he is talking about. Here's J.M. Northcross, and he is writing from Black Store, Tippah County, Mississippi, June the 22nd, 1842. And he mentions several congregations that are meeting close by him. And I'll have one that's a little closer that you'll be able to see that to be the case. And so here's another interesting thing here. There's a Brother Carroll Kendrick of Stanford, Kentucky, and he's returned back home from a visit in Tippah County, Mississippi, and he comes with his wife, his consort, and he is there to visit his mother. So Carroll Kendrick's mother lives in Ripley, Mississippi. Now, who is this Carroll Kendrick? Well, he was born in 1815, died in 1891. He was a gospel preacher. He was an evangelist. He was a true soldier of the cross. He baptized over 20,000 people. And if you'll remember, there are Kendricks in this area. Marvin Rainey, his middle name was Kendrick. So that was a family name that was well known in this area for many years. If I remember correctly, maybe James Childers had some folks that were Kendricks, maybe given names. 1843, there's a William Moody, and he is talking about the Bible Advocate, and he mentions that there are churches at Liberty that has 40 members. There's one where Brother Northcross lives that has 16. There's one that is at Tippah that is 11. He says there's 77 good, loving disciples in all. And here is in 1844, there are 39 members at Pine Grove. This is all in North Mississippi in the Tippah County area. There's 60 at Liberty. There are 13 at Mount Zion. There are 7 at Head of Hatchie. There's 96 at Farmington. And there is 90 that is at New Hope. And A.G. Freed comes to Essery Springs, just a few miles north of here, and now it's out in the sticks. And people ask the question, why does he come and establish a school that eventually becomes Freed-Hardeman when it's out in the sticks? Well, in that time, it wasn't out in the sticks. It had a railroad. It had springs where, where you would come and you would bathe for healing purposes. So it was a tourist place, but mainly it had a railroad. That was the way in which people were able to travel for long distances. And so here's the Enon Church of Christ, 1845. I visited the cemetery in 2003 for the first time, and it was overgrown. The next time, 2007, some people had come out and cleaned it out where you could find all of the graves. There was a church building that burned of natural causes in 1860, so it was 15 years old, and it's at the Enon Cemetery, Tempe County. If you turn left at Faulkner High School, that's the New Salem Road, I believe, and you go up a few miles where W.C. Jackson's museum, his house was. You go just about a half a mile on the right, out in the pine thicket. That's where this cemetery is. And here is a map that I got from Brother Rutledge. There's the Enon Cemetery over on the left, middle ways, and there's the church built in 1845. You have Kendrick land there. You have Shapley's. You have who else? You have the McCoys. You have the Craigs. You have the Rowlands, spelled with a R-O-W. And over to the right there is Tippersville Church of Christ. And here is a man by the name of Northcross, J.M. We've mentioned him, and he dies in 1855. His wife dies in 1872. But down at the bottom, she was a Christian for 40 years, which meant that she became a Christian in 1832. And that's just right up the road here, just about where you go to Faulkner. Here are some of their children's names. There's Alexander Campbell. Matthew Hackworth was a gospel preacher. They named their son. Walter Scott was a restoration preacher. So they named their children with those kinds of names. Here's Dr. James Hackworth. There is Matthew H. Northcross. Brother Northcross, whenever A.G. Freed got married, he married one of his students at Essery Springs. And the person who said the ceremony was M.H. Northcross. And next we're going to look at the old Hickory Flat Cemetery. How many people know where that is? All right, if you go out, Highway 5, go through Blue Mountain and go that direction, go to Hickory Flat, just before you turn right, pardon? Highway 2, okay. Been a long time since I've been there. I went by that hundreds of times, but back a few years ago, I found out something important about or who is buried there. So there's a woman by the name of Mary. She marries a W.A. Crum. And she is the youngest daughter of John Smith, and W.A. Crum was married. They were married when they were very young. There was no discussion about the baby, about baptism or anything like that, but her father-in-law, Eli Crum, was an elder in the Presbyterian Church, and he urged his son to have the babe baptized. And here's what she said. She said, "If God so teaches and I am willing, I have heard that there is no command nor example for baptizing infants. But show me the scriptures for it, and I will consent at once." Eli and his minister hesitated and delayed to furnish William with the needed word. This led to young Crum into diligent research, which resulted in his full acceptance of the New Testament faith. And look at his marker. Died in 1911. In life, non-sectarian, an humble disciple of Christ, a Christian, always advocating the unity of the faith and the bond of peace. He worshiped God and loved mankind, his creed, the Bible. And he is living in 1851 in Ripley, Mississippi. He's a lawyer. He is living in Ripley, Mississippi in 1881. And so in 1884, he makes this statement. He says, "I closed a meeting of 8 days at Hickory Flat in Benton County last Lord's Day. Only one made the good confession. The floods of rain did much to prevent a hearing. My son, W.E. Crum, is now engaged in a meeting at Hopkins Crossing in this county, Tempe. I began a meeting at Dumas next Sunday." And then later on he says in Antioch in Tennessee. And so here he is stating something about his son. He's stating about Hopkins. Any of you know where Hopkins Cemetery is? That's the general area. Just south of Highway 370, I believe that's the road, from Faulkner to Ashland. And my great-grandfather is buried there, and grandmother. So we're going to start now with the beginning of the Ripley Church of Christ. And if you'll notice that there will be some discussion, I think I have 5 or 6 histories, and some say 1923 and some say 1924. So we got to answer that question. If we come up with 1924, then we got to do this all again next year, I guess. So, but there are folks who say no, we're not going to do that. 1890. Here is A.G. Freed, co-founder of Freed-Hardeman University. He is preaching at Ripley, Mississippi. And this wouldn't be at Union, because Union is not started until about 3 years later by T.B. Larimore. So there's preaching that is being done in 1890. Here in 1914, there's a preacher by the name of W.S. Long. His father also, senior, was a gospel preacher as well. He talks about that this is a mission field. Here's D.P. Craig. He says that I'm going to be preaching, and you can address me either at Walnut or at Ripley, Mississippi. This is 1924. So H.D. Jeffcoat, his son Bill Jeffcoat, was the choral director at Freed-Hardeman for several years. Followed me at Olive Branch. This is his dad, buried in Fulton, Mississippi. And he talks about a meeting house that's going to be erected in the near future. Let's read this, because this becomes an issue here. We closed a 5 nights meeting here last night. This is October the 6th, 1924. As there, he says, I believe that this work will get right, as there are only a few that want the organ, and they have agreed to leave it off if it causes any trouble. A new house of worship is to be erected in the near future with the restrictive clause in the deed, which will keep the board from, and he's talking about the Missionary Society Board, from ever taking it. Ripley is a good town of about 2,000. A good, strong preacher is needed. And now what you're going to see in 1924 is you're going to see that there is a Christian church that's meeting at the courthouse. And the reason for that is there is the person who is the superintendent. That is, there's the Missionary Society has sent him here for the purpose of starting a Christian church. And so here you have the statement in 1924 that W.E. Crum will be preaching. W.E. Crum was the first full-time preacher, or the first preacher, really, that the Beach Hill congregation had. And we'll see his name more often. Now, here's where it gets quite interesting. This man, Adlai Lowdy, this is 1924. He is advertising a meeting, and he says the Big Tent is located at the T.R. Craig lot just across from the school building. That would be, I'm assuming, the high school down on Main Street, about where City Hall is now. And it is, this meeting, he says, was attended by large crowds. Mr. Lowdy is one of the greatest preachers in his denomination and one of the best singers ever heard. And so here is, this is what is being written about this man that is coming. But this man went to school at Milligan College, which is the Christian school that President Ronald Reagan attended. You remember that he was associated with the Christian church. That's where he went to school. And this man is located there. And he was born in 1893, so he's fairly young when he comes to Ripley. And here on his gravesite, he was an evangelist, he was a singer, composer of songs, he was an author. The church at Ripley was planted as a result of a gospel meeting in the fall of 1924. So he's given credit for the planting of the Ripley church. And here's the advertisement that's given. His wife is also going to come and sing. So that's the way in which they are approaching the preaching of the gospel. Here's another advertisement that is about him. And here is what he says. This is what he says on, there's still a website that's selling his books. And this is this is an autobiography that he wrote. And what I want you to see is that he says, I terminated my services with Dr. Thomas in the late summer of 1923. And he says, I began my full-time independent Bible lecture ministry of God's Purpose of the Ages using my big colored chart. My first ministry was held in Ripley, Mississippi. And then he goes and talks about all the other places he went. And then he says, I come back in July through August the 10th in 1924. And he says, I was using a tent for our crowds. And then he says he goes to Hickory Flat, or he says Flats, but it's Hickory Flat. And so in 1924, there is material that's being put on the ground this week for the erection of the Christian church in Ripley. It will be located on the east side of Commerce Street on a lot purchased from A.C. Anderson. And then there is the statement from the Christian church about Loudy coming, and he's going to be holding a meeting. And notice the number of people that are baptized. He has a large congregation, and 114 people joined the church, 87 of whom were baptized by Mr. Loudy. This gives the Ripley Church a membership of about 200. I think one of the histories says that the Ripley Church started off pretty small, but I would say that's not starting off very small. Now keep in mind what you're going to have is you're going to have some folks that are going to be for the instrument. You're going to have some that are going to be opposed to the instrument. So you could start out with a group like that and basically not end up with a congregation near that large. But anyway, one of the interesting things that takes place is that Loudy and a Baptist preacher by the name of Wells in August of 1924 have a debate. And how many people do you think attended that debate in 1924? Anybody want to take a guess? 500. Okay, let's look at it. Here's another statement. I will get to it in just a moment. Here's a statement about services of the Christian church, September 1924. Another statement about it. There were 5,000 people that attended the debate. And some nights there were 3,000, 4,000, but the biggest crowd they estimated was 5,000 people. Can you imagine 5,000 people in Ripley attending a religious discussion? Brother Gus Nichols' brother, Charlie Nichols, preaches here in 1924. Brother Crum dies in September 1924. Then there's preaching that is done at Faulkner. There's preaching that's done at Blue Mountain. There's preaching that's done all over the county. It's not just Ripley and a couple other places. It's everywhere that the preaching is being done. And the preacher that is preaching there at Faulkner is Smith Chambers. And we'll find out one of the preachers that really helped the Ripley congregation was Frank Chambers. This is his son. And here's, first of all, here's Brother Tapp. Brother Tapp lived in Alamo, and so he moved to the Walnut area, and then he was associated with the church here, but he also started a church helped start one in Blue Mountain. And so here's this A. Chambers. Notice he's 21 years old. He dies tragically at an early age. He's the only child that the Chambers have. And that must have been a burden for him to carry. What I found interesting in 1925, that there is Edgar Spite May. If I remember correctly, Carol's mother, Doris Day, who was a caregiver, stayed with Spite May during his declining years. But notice what he does. He sends money in for 9 homes to receive the Gospel Advocate. Look on the right over there at his children. There is Nettie Ketchum. There's, and I'm looking mostly at the girls. There's Bessie Bieber. There is Loetta. There is Ollie. Her husband was an elder to Ashland. There's Beatrice. Beatrice was married to Lloyd, and I used to pick lots of cotton for Lloyd Shackford. And then, of course, Amy May. Look at what a great influence that he had by promoting good education, reading materials for his family. E.R. Harper preached here in 1926. Brother Harper actually taught school up at Collegiate, and he's coming to the Picture Show Auditorium. Yes, they had picture shows in 1926. Here's a picture of Brother Harper. Brother Harper was a very kind and gentle man, and he really gave me a good workover. Carol and I had been married this would have been 1971, so we were married less than 15 years. And he said, Tom, you get in here and you wash these dishes. You help your wife. And whenever he got up from the breakfast table, he'd take them to the sink and he'd wash them out right there. So he was a great person. I'm thankful that I was able to know him. N.B. Hardeman preached here in 1926. He returning from his lectureship, his trip overseas. But also notice that there's a mention made of his preaching in the Ryan Auditorium, Gospel Grand Ole Opry place, meeting place. And this takes place in the 1920s, and he has 6,000 to 8,000 people that come. And every day the newspaper publishes the night before, word for word, everything that Brother Hardman speaks about. So those were some remarkable times. Here's the idea of the new services in the new Christian church. And if you look at it closely, you probably can't read it, but the first line says, the first service in the new building of the Church of Christ. So you see, sometimes when people are setting the type at the top of it, they put Christian church, but the person writing the article says Church of Christ. So you have that sort of thing. And J. Roy Vaughn is the person that submits that document. His son, John, is still living. He's a good friend of mine. Brother Vaughn's wife was from Mathiston, Mississippi, and my first work after graduating from Freed Hardeman was in Mathiston. So here's the church building. The preacher's house is over on the left, and down below that is where the Roach sisters lived. They built a house about the same time that the church building is built. There's Brother John Roy Vaughn, died in 1982. He was editor of the Gospel Advocate. So here you have church services in 1926. Here you have a Brother Moody that is going to help out from Freed Hardeman. You have Sunday night services. And notice what time they start on Sunday night. They start at 7:45. They didn't put their kids to bed as early as we do now. So there are announcements that are put in the paper about it. Now here is the Christian church going on at the same time. And they're trying to get their feet on the ground. They're trying to get started. And so they have a group of women, and they're organizing a mission study class. And then here's other information about it. And notice they elect various people involved in the situation. Interesting to note some of these names and doing research on some of these names. Here's a preacher for the Christian church that is coming in and speaking. There's his obituary when he dies at age 73. There's an announcement in 26 about preaching. There is a new preacher that is coming in. He's actually going to kind of fill in for Brother Vaughn. Brother Vaughn is going to be doing some mission work, and so for the summer months or so, he's filling in. And so this person is mentioned here. His name is John R. Horvis, and he dies at a very early age, 34. He drowns, and his body is in a lake for several days before they're able to locate it. So here you have the services, and this person is T. Coy Porter. His dad was Rue Porter, a well-known, well-respected gospel preacher in Missouri. And so here is the meeting that Dean Ellis Walker is talking about. Here you have O.S. Lanham. And I talked to a person last night who was married by this man. And she talked to me and told me some things about him. He left here, went to Arkansas, and then from Arkansas he went to Fayetteville, Tennessee, and that's where this lady was from. That's where she got married. And there is where he is buried, information about him. And so you have Brother E.L. Whitaker. This would be E.L. Whitaker Sr. His son Junior preached at Knight Arnold, and Brother Whitaker was preaching here at Ripley in 1949 whenever he passed away. You have S.A. Freeman. He is noted several times. There's Brother McCoy mentioned, and there is when he died in 2010. You have another preacher, C.C. Doggett, and he dies in 1967. So I'm going to spend about maybe 10 minutes of my time, and if you have any questions, I would be glad to entertain the questions. But I want to tell you about my roots in this congregation. And so my grandfather, great-grandfather, my mother's grandfather, he obeyed the gospel in 1936 because a man by the name of D.L. Robinson came and preached the gospel. My mother was baptized by Everett Day Sr. at the Blackwell Church of Christ, just off of 370, right close to the Benton-Tippah County line. And interesting, brother, this was 2 years before I was born. And you fast forward to 1964, and I marry Everett Day's great niece. Carol's granddad and Everett Day were brothers. And so that's the relationship. And then you have Everett Jr. Whenever we moved to Henderson, our neighbor about 3 houses down was Everett Day Jr. And he led the singing while I was a young person at Freed Hardeman. And he married Tom Jackson's daughter. Her name was Doris. So we have 2 Doris Days in the family. My mother-in-law was Doris Day. She was Doris Shelton Day. And then you have Doris Jackson Day. And what's ironic is Tom Jackson and my daddy were first cousins. And so we have Doris is my second cousin, and Everett is Carol's second cousin, but we're not kin to each other. I keep thinking, well, if I keep on looking, we're going to end up being kin to one another, but it never worked out that way. And this is something, one of the side effects of doing research is you find out a lot of interesting things. I told people for a long, long time I was born at Faulkner, out from Faulkner. But guess where I was born? I found this out just a few months ago. I was born at Finger, Mississippi. Guess where I preach? I live in Henderson, but guess where I preach? I preach in Finger, Tennessee. And there they say the town got its name because somebody pointed a finger. I don't believe that. This town was named Finger because of probably S.S. Finger. Because we would pick cotton, and we would take our money, and we would go to M.L. Finger & Son and buy our clothes for the winter. We lived in the Finger old home place when I was in the first grade. And so right across the road, and by the way, here's something else I found. Private Leroy Childers is at home on a 10-day furlough. He came to see his new son, Thomas Lee, born May the 5th. We congratulate Mr. and Mrs. Childers. First 2.5 years of my life, I didn't really see my dad that much, but he saw me as a newborn. So that was a delight to my heart. I took this picture in 1973. That's the Finger Line Schoolhouse. And my daddy went to school there. And right across the road, I was born in my grandmother Bennett's house. So I was born right across the road from this place right here. And I think this picture right here is the schoolhouse on the right. You've got a bunch of kids there, and they're playing baseball. Must be spring break or something. But Finger, Mississippi had a post office. It had 2 stores, and it had a school. But when the railroad came through Faulkner, then Faulkner grew, and Finger just became a community. Here is my favorite story. Here's a man by the name of Rubel Eugene White. Anybody remember the Whites? I'm not going to say his nickname. Somebody else say it. Say it a little louder. Squatty White. Well, I guess I did say it. But I want you to notice when he was baptized. He was baptized in March of 1952. You know what he was doing in 1953? He had sold my mother and daddy a refrigerator, a used refrigerator that didn't work very well. And I'm 10 years old. We live Murray Spur Road. You turn the Industrial Park Road. We're the first house. It was the Norton house, but it was a brand new house. It was a rent house. And Mother is standing there, and he's sitting on the stool, and they're talking the Bible, discussing the Bible. And Sunday morning, I'm 10 years old. My sister, Mary Helen, is 7 years old. My younger sister, Lois, is 5 years old. And my brother, David, we brought him home during the ice storm in what year? 1951. So he's 2 years old. And I can still see just as clear as anything, Mother walking down that aisle. She's restored. And that changed everything. The first year, we were given not a fruit basket for Christmas, we were given a box of groceries. Because you look at those children, and can't you see how they need it? We didn't have church clothes, but they never did it again. Why? Because the Lord blessed us, and we didn't need it after that. So I'm always grateful to this man right here because of what he did. He becomes a preacher. You got to be careful studying the Bible. You better be careful about having studies with people. If you're preacher material, it may turn you into a preacher. And the preacher who baptized me was Clyde Miller. And I had the opportunity of visiting with him probably 2000, 2003, and it was amazing how much he knew about what was going on in Ripley, even though he hadn't been in Ripley really for 50 years. And so here I am in 1968. I'll graduate in May. Look at all that hair. Boy, isn't birthdays rough on you? That's my mother and daddy. My mother's funeral was right here in the building in 1970. She died when she was 47. I've lost both of my sisters. They went to Freed-Hardeman. I was at Freed-Hardeman with Lois and with Mary on the left, and we were all there at the same time. They graduated, and they went to Harding and became school teachers. My brother David, he went into the Army and came out a full bird colonel. The last day he was in uniform, he jogged with the President of the United States. That's a long ways from Ripley, Mississippi in those days. I always wondered when was the first time I saw Carol, and I think I found the answer to it. Here she attended, notice the perfect attendance. This is the 5th and 6th grade. It's 1958. Carol was born in 46, so her birthday's not till September, so she's 11 years old, if I counted the mouth right. And I'm 3.5 years older, so I'm 14 or 15. You think I'm looking at an 11-year-old girl? No, probably not. But look at who her teacher is. I didn't really do the research on Marie Wallace. I'm not sure who that is. Maybe somebody can remind me. But Charlene Shelton Jackson. Her daddy's was David Richard Shelton. And what do we know about David Richard Shelton? Well, he was a school teacher. And he went to school at Georgia Robinson. And when he got married, you know who said the ceremony? The president of the school. Who else? A.G. Freed said his wedding ceremony. And his son, Edwin, became a gospel preacher. And when he died, Frank Chambers and S.A. Freeman had his service. And Freeman writes about that. And Edwin, you're related to this guy, aren't you? So yeah, we have that in common. So we have another one the next year. Again, perfect attendance. Cecil May signs it. Charlene Jackson. She's the person. So here is when Carol. When I got back from the National Guard, we were married in '64, and 6 weeks later I had to go to basic training, and I was gone for almost 6 months. When we came back in September of '64, when I came back, then we rented part of the house for Mr. Everett Childers. Any of you remember Mr. Everett? He lived right beside Witt's Big Star. His house sided with Oak Street. And he had lost his wife, and we were probably related. I never did figure out exactly how we were related, but he had lost his wife, very lonely, and Carol and I spent probably 3 months discussing the Bible with him. And he became a Christian. And about that time, we are in the preacher's house, in the living room. We're having a visitation meeting, and Ouida Cargyle says, Tommy Lee, you ought to think about being a preacher. And that just kind of started everything going. And so I give her credit for encouraging me in that particular way. These are two of the opera seats out of the old church building. I started to bring them, but those things are pretty heavy. Stoney or what was his father's name? Bob Medlin. He made that for me. And I'd had that for a good while, and I happened to think, I don't think I checked to see if there was any chewing gum underneath the seat, but I checked the back. What do you think I found on the back? Would you like to see what I found on the back? I didn't do it. There's Tommy and Billy Joe Wallace. We were buddies going to church together. He died tragically a few years after that. But I found something else on the hymn book. I don't think if he's here, I hadn't seen him to defend himself. But anybody recognize that name? I only know one Tim with the last name starting with M. The second preacher that I knew was Alan Dixon. His father was president of the Freed-Hardeman. He died he died in '68 after I'd graduated in May. This person that said the ceremony for me and Carol was Jim Allen. And he was here when the building was built. And I visited in 2017 with his wife, Margie. And so she's was living, I'm not sure that she's still living, but she was in a retirement home. Looks like she could live a long time like that. She looks really good. Malcolm George died in December of this past year. He was the preacher here when I decided to go to Freed-Hardeman. He helped me to get a scholarship. He was very encouraging to me. Robert Taylor was also a preacher who was very encouraging. He died in March the 28th of this year at age 91. Guy Hester. I knew all the Hester clan from Vernon, Alabama. They have great roots down there. I think his parents are buried there. James Horton, who is here. One of the things that this congregation is known for is not so much their preachers, but their preachers' wives. So you have Rose, and you have Lucy Brown, and you may have some others. I'm not real sure. But, whoops, too fast. Glenn Fan died in March of this past March a year ago. And he's buried in Holly Springs. And then you have, that's Paul who died, but you have the other preachers that were here later on. So here are a list of the preachers, and I'll let you go through it. But here again, I may be off on some of the dates, but here are the list of the preachers. So, man, I can't believe I got through in about an hour. Whew, I was worried about that. I was afraid I'd be here to midnight. Anybody have a question that you want to present or anything you want to comment about? I think we're going to, after we eat, we're going to come back here and maybe if people have stories to tell, then.
We hold the questions for after supper.
All right, you want to just do all of them.
I'm just glad you don't have my grave up there.
Have what?
My grave.
Well, we could arrange that, I guess. No, I'm kidding. We could not do that. I could. But, by the way, Donnie, like the rest of us, he really married someone special. Jesse was one of Carol's students. Carol had student workers. She would get about 600 phone calls a day, and she very seldom ever had to look up numbers. But she had college students that worked for her to help her out because she had 4 lines, and sometimes all 4 lines were ringing at one time. But Jesse was one of her students. We went to the wedding. You remember what your song was whenever you the end of the wedding? You remember the name of the song? What was it? It was Break a Leg, wasn't it? I think it was Break a Leg. Yeah, that's what I remember. So, but who am I? I'm old and forgetful. So, okay, we'll hold all the questions till after we eat. But I was thinking if somebody had questions, if you plan to eat and leave and not come back, if you wanted, but now you won't even dare ask a question, will you? So. But thank you. This has been great. I'm glad that you did this, and I'm especially glad that you let me be a part. Because in 1966, I stood right there. Malcolm George had a class, and I made my first talk. My first talk. It wasn't a sermon. It was my first talk. And I never will forget that spot. I don't remember what I said, but it was right there. So this place will always be special because of that. Thank you very much.